The fire started at 11 minutes past midnight. Dorothy Callahan knew the exact time because she had been awake the way she was always awake at that hour, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of chamomile gone cold, and the book she'd stopped reading 40 minutes ago still open on the table. Sleep came harder these days, had come harder since Ray died, harder still since she'd moved out here to the edge of Harlan County, where the nights were so quiet you could hear your own thoughts chewing on themselves. She didn't mind the quiet usually. The quiet was honest. The quiet didn't pretend to be something it wasn't, the way people did, the way the town did, the way certain men in this county did when they put on a uniform and a badge and went home to leave bruises where the fabric would cover them. She smelled the smoke before she saw the light. It came through the screen door off the back porch, thin and acrid, the smell of old wood catching and insulation burning. And Dorothy was on her feet before the rational part of her brain had finished processing what her nose was telling it. 41 years as an emergency room nurse had given her a body that moved while her mind was still asking questions. She crossed the kitchen, pushed through the screen door, and stopped at the edge of the porch. The shed at the back of the property was burning, not smoldering, not beginning to catch. Burning orange and hungry, the dry August timber going up like it had been waiting for an excuse. The heat reached her from 30 yards away, a wall pressing against her face and forearms. Inside the shed, Ray's old tools, the lawnmower, 2 cords of firewood stacked for winter, and the filing cabinet she kept locked with the copies of every document Cassie Mercer had given her over the past 3 weeks. Dorothy stood on the porch for 4 seconds. Then she turned, went back inside, picked up the cordless phone from the counter, and dialed 911 while she was already pulling on her boots. Harlan County Emergency. This is Dorothy Callahan at 4412 Prentice Road. My outbuilding is on fire. I need the fire department, and I need you to log the time of this call because I will be asking for that record in a court proceeding. She laced the first boot. I also need you to note that this property has been the subject of 2 prior incidents this week. A cut brake line on my truck Thursday, and a broken window with a stone thrown through it Saturday. Both reported, both on file. A pause from the dispatcher. Ma'am, are you in immediate danger? Not yet. She laced the second boot. Send the fire department. She hung up and went back outside with the garden hose. The filing cabinet was steel. Whatever was in it, whoever had set this fire, thinking they would burn away her documentation, they had made a fundamental error. Dorothy Callahan had not survived 41 years of night shifts and bad decisions and one husband with a bad heart and this county's particular flavor of institutional corruption by making things easy to destroy. The originals of every document Cassie Mercer had provided were locked in a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Lexington, 60 miles east, where Wade Mercer had no jurisdiction and Sheriff Earl Briggs had no friends that Dorothy knew of. She dragged the hose to its full extension and pointed the stream at the shed wall, not at the fire itself, but at the grass between the shed and the back fence, wetting down the path the fire would take if it spread. It was what you did in a burn situation when you couldn't stop the thing itself. You controlled the edges. You protected what you could reach. She was still doing this when the motorcycles turned off Prentice Road. She didn't hear them at first over the roar of the fire and the hiss of the hose. Then the sound cut through a low rumble that she felt in her sternum before her ears fully registered it, and she turned to see headlights swinging through the gap in the tree line at the edge of her property. Not one set of lights, many. She counted without thinking the way she'd counted heartbeats and breaths in pill quantities through 4 decades of clinical habit. 7 motorcycles came up the gravel drive and stopped in a rough line 20 yards from where she stood with the hose. The engines died. The men who climbed off them were large, which was the first thing you noticed, and then you noticed the leather and the patches and the particular way they held themselves, which was the way of men who had decided a long time ago that they were the most dangerous thing in any room they entered, and had subsequently stopped worrying about it. 7 of them. The nearest was tall, with a gray beard going to his chest, and eyes the color of iron filings. He wore a cut that had more road on it than most roads did. The patch on his chest read, Iron Reapers MC, and below it a smaller patch, Sergeant at Arms. He looked at Dorothy. He looked at the burning shed. He looked at the hose in her hand and the particular angle of her shoulders, which was not the angle of a frightened woman, but of a woman who had decided to do the available thing and was doing it. You need help, he said. His voice was gravel, poured over gravel. I need the fire department, Dorothy said. But since they're not here yet, yes. He turned to the men behind him. 2 words no louder than she'd spoken. Blankets, shovels. The men moved before he finished saying it, going to the saddlebags on their bikes with the efficiency of people who were accustomed to problems that required physical solutions. In under a minute, they had fire blankets unrolled and dirt being thrown against the base of the shed wall where the fire was trying to creep along the ground toward the fence. Dorothy kept the hose going. The man with the gray beard stood beside her, not in her way, just present. Iron Reapers, she said, not a question, just identifying what she was seeing. Vince Rourke, he said. We camped the ridge about a mile north. Saw the glow. Dorothy Callahan. She adjusted the hose angle. You're welcome on my property. Much obliged. They worked in a silence that was comfortable in the way silence gets comfortable between people who are focused on the same problem. The fire department arrived 11 minutes later, which Dorothy logged mentally because 11 minutes was too long, and she intended to say so at the next county commission meeting. The firefighters went to work with their equipment, and Dorothy stepped back and let them, standing at the edge of the light, with Vince Rourke a few feet away and 6 of his men forming a loose half-circle that faced outward, not inward, which she noticed. They were watching the tree line, watching the road, not watching her. You're expecting company, she said. Rourke's jaw moved slightly. The kind of fire that starts clean and fast in a dry shed on a calm night usually has company. Dorothy looked at him. In the firelight, his face was a geography of old damage. A scar tracing the left cheekbone, knuckles that had been broken and healed and broken again. He was maybe 60, maybe older, with the kind of physical presence that was less about size than density, as though whatever he was made of had been compressed over years until it had no room left for softness. It was said, she said. No, who? I have a good idea. Rourke waited. He was patient the way old rivers were patient. Not still exactly, but deeply unhurried. Deputy Wade Mercer, Dorothy said. Or someone working for him. She paused. Or someone working for his boss. What did you do to Deputy Mercer? I saw what he did to his wife. I wrote it down. I photographed the injuries with her consent. I filed a complaint with the Harlan County Sheriff's Department, which turned out to be a somewhat optimistic choice, given that the sheriff is Earl Briggs, who is Wade Mercer's uncle by marriage, and the man who hired him. She watched a firefighter direct a stream at the shed roof. When the complaint was dismissed, I filed a copy with the state attorney general's office and retained a family law attorney for Cassie Mercer. The next day, someone cut my brake line. 2 days after that, a stone came through my kitchen window. Tonight, this. Rourke was quiet for a moment. You live alone, he said. Since my husband passed. 7 years. Kids. A daughter in Cincinnati. She doesn't need to know about this yet. Rourke nodded slowly. His eyes had never stopped moving, tracking the periphery of her property with the methodical attention of a man reading a landscape for threat. Where's the wife? Mercer's wife, Cassie. She's at her sister's place in Lexington. I got her out 4 days ago when I realized the complaint was going nowhere and Mercer would escalate. Dorothy finally let the hose drop to her side. The firefighters had the shed mostly contained. What was left of it was going to be a loss, but the fire wasn't going anywhere else now. I've been trying to get her a protective order. The hearing is in 10 days. 10 days is a long time, Rourke said. I'm aware. He looked at her for the first time directly, not the sideways assessment he'd been doing since he arrived, but a straight-on look, the kind that was evaluating something beyond the immediate facts of the situation. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find something that satisfied him, Or at least something that didn't turn him away. "We're camped up on the ridge through the end of the week," he said. "Annual run Eastern Kentucky Circuit. Passes through here every year." He paused. "We can move the camp closer. Say the lower meadow if you own it." "I own it. Then we'll move. No cost to you. We keep our own camp, make our own fire. Don't come onto your property uninvited." He held her gaze. "But we'd know if someone came up your road at night." Dorothy considered this. She had lived 72 years by being careful about the situations she walked into, about what she accepted, from whom, and on what terms. She had also lived 72 years by recognizing when an offer was genuine and when there was nothing behind it but performance. "I appreciate that," she said. "I'll have fresh coffee at 6 if anyone wants it." Something shifted in Rourke's expression. Not quite a smile, but the topography of one. "We'll be here." The fire department packed out at 2 in the morning. What remained of the shed was a scorched frame and a concrete pad with a steel filing cabinet sitting on it, locked and intact, its contents entirely unharmed. Dorothy went to bed at 3. She slept 4 hours, which was better than usual. And by minutes, she had come to Harlan County by choice, which people found surprising. Dorothy Callahan had spent her working life in Louisville, had raised her daughter there, had buried Ray there, in a good cemetery on the eastern edge of the city. She could have stayed. Her daughter had wanted her to stay. There were grandchildren in Cincinnati, a life that looked like the life people describe when they describe what old age was supposed to look like. Slow and warm and safely surrounded. But Dorothy had looked at that life and understood that it was not her life, that she was not built for slow and warm, that the thing that had driven her through 41 years of emergency nursing was still running inside her at full throttle, and if she didn't give it something real to run toward, it would eat her alive. She had found the Harlan County property through a cousin. 6 acres of eastern Kentucky hillside with a house that needed work, and land that needed use, and a small town 8 miles down the road that needed, as she'd come to learn, rather a lot of things. She'd done the house herself, mostly with contractors where the work was beyond her, and her own hands where it wasn't. She'd put in a kitchen garden. She'd started volunteering at the county health clinic 2 days a week, doing the intake assessments that the understaffed nurses didn't have time for. That was how she'd met Cassie Mercer. Cassie had come in on a Tuesday in June for what the appointment notes described as a routine follow-up for a sprained wrist. Dorothy had been doing intake. She was 58 years old in the intake notes. She looked younger, but moved like someone carrying pain she'd learned to budget around. When Dorothy had asked about the wrist, and Cassie had given the answer people gave when they were giving the rehearsed answer, Dorothy had not pushed. She documented what she saw and what Cassie told her, and had let the appointment proceed. But she had also written her personal phone number on the back of a clinic card and slid it across the table when she handed Cassie the follow-up paperwork. She hadn't said anything. She hadn't had to. In 41 years, you learn the difference between a woman who didn't know she needed help and a woman who knew but hadn't found someone she trusted enough to take it from. Cassie called 3 weeks later. By that point, the wrist had healed. 2 ribs had not. What followed was 2 months of careful, patient work. Dorothy had done this before, not in Harlan County, but in Louisville, in the emergency room where she'd watched women come in with the same choreography of injuries and the same careful explanations, and had learned that you could not rush this, that you could not grab a woman by the arm and pull her towards safety because the grab felt too much like everything else that had grabbed her, and she would flinch away from safety as readily as from danger if you moved too fast. You had to build the road 1 stone at a time and let her walk it when she was ready. Cassie Mercer had been ready in August. Dorothy had helped her pack a bag on a Thursday afternoon when Wade Mercer was on shift, had driven her to her sister's place in Lexington herself, had come home and filed the complaint with the sheriff's department the following morning, knowing even as she did it that Earl Briggs would dismiss it, not because she had no evidence, but because the evidence threatened a man Briggs had reason to protect. She had not expected the break line. That had been her miscalculation, or rather her underestimation of how quickly Briggs and Wade Mercer would move to protect themselves. In Louisville, the department had been large enough that corruption had to be distributed, had to hide in the paperwork, in the missed filings and the closed cases. In a county this small, corruption was simpler. It was just men who knew each other, and owed each other, and understood that the way to keep owing and being owed was to make problems disappear before they became public. Dorothy was a problem. She had decided the morning after the break line that she was going to remain one. The coffee she put on at 6 was a full-pot dark roast, the real kind made in the old percolator Ray had bought at a hardware store in 1987, and that still made better coffee than anything with a brand name and a display screen. She set it on the porch with a stack of mugs and went inside to make the cornbread she'd been meaning to make for 3 days. She heard the bikes come down from the ridge meadow before she saw the men, that low, rolling thunder that you felt before you heard it. They came into the yard 3 at a time, engines dropping to a mutter and then dying, and Dorothy counted 14 of them, now more than the 7 from the previous night, the rest apparently having come down from the camp. Vince Rourke came onto the porch last. He had the unhurried quality of a man who didn't feel the need to arrive first. "Sleep," he said. "4 hours, you. About the same." He poured himself coffee without asking, which she took as a sign of a man comfortable enough to be at ease without needing permission for small things. He stood at the porch railing with the mug and looked at the scorched ground where the shed had been. The concrete pad was visible in the morning light, gray and stark. The steel filing cabinet sat where it had been when the firefighters packed out. "That what they were after?" he said, nodding toward it. "Probably. They'd have been disappointed." She brought the cornbread out. "Copies. The originals are in Lexington." Rourke turned from the railing and looked at her. "You anticipated it." "I anticipated something. The brake line was the first escalation. After the brake line, I moved anything important off the property." She set the cornbread down. "Come and eat, all of you." The men came onto the porch in a movement that was less a group decision than a natural redistribution, the way water finds its level. They were of various ages, the youngest maybe 30, the oldest a lean man with white hair and a quiet face, perhaps older than Dorothy herself. They were polite in the way of men who were polite when they chose to be, which was different from the politeness of men who didn't know any other register. They took coffee and cornbread and stood or sat and didn't take up more space than they needed. Rourke stayed at the railing. "Tell me about Briggs," he said. Dorothy sat down with her own coffee. She had been deciding since she woke up how much to say. She had arrived at the decision to say most of it because she was not a woman who believed in managing information at the cost of other people's ability to help her, and because these men were already involved by virtue of being here, and because there was something in Rourke's manner that suggested he would already know more than she expected. She told him about Cassie. She told him about Wade Mercer. She told him about the complaint and the dismissal and the brake line and the window and the fire. She told him about the hearing in 10 days and the protective order that was the immediate goal, but not the real goal. The real goal being to get Cassie's testimony into a proceeding where it would be protected, and where what she knew about Wade Mercer's activities beyond the domestic violence would have to be dealt with. "She knows more than the hitting," Dorothy said. "That's the part Briggs is actually worried about. The hitting, Briggs could probably survive that. A deputy with a domestic violence complaint gets shuffled, transferred, maybe loses his badge if the AG pushes hard. Briggs loses a relative and a loyal employee. Manageable." She watched Rourke's face. "But Cassie has been in that house for 3 years. She's observant the way women are observant when they're trying to predict danger. She's seen things. She's heard things. Wade is not careful at home the way he is in public." "What things?" Dorothy looked at her coffee. "I don't know the full extent of it. Cassie told me enough to understand that it goes beyond Wade's personal conduct. There are other names. There are vehicles she's seen. There are phone calls she's overheard. There are cash payments to Wade that don't have an obvious source." She paused. She's been writing it down since January. Everything she remembered. everything she observed. Rourke was very still. She give those notes to anyone. She gave them to me. I have them with the other documents in Lexington. Does Briggs know about the notes? I don't think so. I think Briggs knows Cassie filed a complaint and that I helped her file it. I think he knows I'm pushing for the protective order hearing. What he doesn't know, I hope, is what Cassie's documents actually contain. Rourke set his mug down on the railing. He looked at the meadow beyond the tree line, then back at Dorothy. Behind him, the other men had gone quiet in that way that wasn't the absence of listening, but the presence of it. You understand what you're sitting on, he said. Yes, and you've been living out here alone with it. I'm a 72-year-old woman in a county where the corruption is known to everyone and tolerated by most, Dorothy said. The best protection I have is that Briggs underestimates me. Men in his position usually do. She met Rourke's gaze. That's not a complaint, it's a tactical assessment. Something moved in his expression. The almost smile again, deeper this time. You were a nurse, he said. Emergency room, 41 years. Louisville General, trauma unit. She looked at him. How did you know that? He didn't answer directly. He picked up his mug again, and for a moment, she had the distinct sense that something had passed between them. Some recognition of a fact that he was not yet prepared to name. It was the way patients sometimes looked at her in the ER when they were still processing whether the situation was real or manageable or both. I knew someone who worked there, he said, a long time ago. Dorothy waited, but he didn't continue. She let it go for now because there were more immediate things. The hearing is September 18th, she said. Briggs will try to get it postponed or transferred to a friendly judge. That's the next move. I have a lawyer working to prevent it, but the lawyer is in Louisville, and the lawyer doesn't know this county the way it knows itself. We'll be here through the 19th, Rourke said. Can move the dates if needed. You'd do that. Club's got flexibility. He said it simply, without drama. And Harlan County is on our circuit. We come through every year. He looked at the scorched concrete pad. Be ashamed to leave before whatever this is gets properly finished. Dorothy looked at the 14 men on her porch. These large, weathered men with their road-worn leather and their patches and their quiet outward attention that never stopped scanning. She had worked with all kinds of people in emergency medicine, had learned to read the character behind the surface presentation, had learned that the people who came through a door in a crisis told you something true about themselves in that first moment that all the subsequent words and context couldn't fully revise. These men had come up her drive in the middle of the night and gone immediately to work on a problem. They had not asked what they'd be getting into. They had not asked who had caused it or whether the person being helped deserved helping. They had simply seen a woman with a fire and a hose and had picked up shovels. That was character. The rest was detail. All right, Dorothy said. Then let me tell you what we know and what we need. Today, what Cassie Mercer had documented over 8 months of quiet, terrified observation was this: Wade Mercer was not simply a man with a violent temperament and the misfortune of having married someone who could witness it. He was a man with a function in a larger structure, and the function was facilitation. Dorothy laid it out for Rourke that afternoon, the two of them at her kitchen table, with the originals now retrieved from Lexington, the documents spread between coffee mugs, and the plate of sandwiches Dorothy had made because it was past noon and feeding people was a reflex she'd never fully shed from the nursing years. Cassie's notes were written in the small, careful script of a woman who'd been a school secretary before she married and had never lost the habit of precise documentation. Dates, times, vehicle descriptions, overheard fragments of conversation. The notations were understated to the point of flatness, which made them more believable, not less. Because people lying wrote with more texture than this, filled in the gaps with convincing detail that truth didn't bother to provide. What emerged from the flat, careful documentation was a pattern. 3 times in the past 8 months, Wade Mercer had received visitors at the house after midnight. Not friends, not family. Men in unmarked vehicles who came through the back, stayed for 15 or 20 minutes, and left. The visits always coincided, per Cassie's notation, With a particular sequence, Wade would receive a call, the number blocked would go to the back bedroom, would emerge 20 minutes later, and within 2 hours the late-night visitors would arrive. The morning after each visit, Wade would deposit cash into an account Cassie had once glimpsed on the bank app he'd left open on the kitchen counter. The amounts weren't staggering. $1,200, $900, $1,500. The kind of money that could be explained a dozen ways to anyone not paying attention. But Cassie was paying attention. More than the cash, she had documented a name. Heard it twice on the back bedroom call spoken by Wade, in the tone of a man who was not giving the name, but receiving it, repeating it back in the way you did when you were confirming an instruction. The name was Halcyon. "That's a distribution brand," Rourke said. He said it without particular emphasis, as though identifying a brand name in a catalog. Dorothy looked at him. "You know it. It's been moving through eastern Kentucky for about 2 years. Fentanyl compound pressed into blue pills. High potency, inconsistent dose. Lot of overdoses." His voice was still level, but something beneath it had changed a tension in the stillness that hadn't been there before. "Club's been seeing it on the circuit. Communities we ride through. People dead in places that don't have resources to deal with it." Cassie documented 3 deliveries at the house. If Wade is receiving on behalf of the distribution, he's not the top. He's middle. Local coordination. "Briggs," Rourke said. "That's my read. Briggs has the authority to manage the territory. Keep the department from looking too hard. Wade is the hands-on connection to the actual movement." Rourke was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table, very still, the scarred knuckles white at the edges. "How long has Briggs been sheriff?" he said. 11 years. And the overdose problem in this county." Dorothy got up and went to the cupboard above the stove, where she kept the folder of printouts she'd assembled from the county health records she had access to through the clinic. She brought it to the table and set it in front of Rourke. "County overdose mortality, Harlan County, Kentucky." The numbers climbed in a slope that began gradual, then steepened sharply around 4 years ago. Rourke looked at the page for a long time. "My son," he said finally. He said it the way you said the words of a sentence you'd rehearsed so many times they had worn smooth, had lost their serration, but could still cut if they found the right angle. "He died 3 years ago. Overdose. Floyd County, not far from here." He looked up from the page. "They couldn't tell me the brand, said the investigation was ongoing." He paused. "Investigation still ongoing." Dorothy held his gaze. "I'm sorry," she said. She didn't add anything to it because there was nothing to add. She had sat with bereaved people for 40 years and had learned that the reflex to fill the silence after those words was not kindness, but its own kind of discomfort, and she was not going to make Vince Rourke carry her discomfort on top of his grief. He nodded once. Then he looked back at the overdose mortality chart. "Halcyon," he said. "I don't know if it's the same supply," Dorothy said carefully. "I don't want to make you a promise the evidence can't keep." "No," he turned the folder back toward her. "But the geography matches. The timeline matches. And now we've got a deputy in the county seat who's taking cash deliveries from someone who uses that name." He looked up. "That's not coincidence." "No," Dorothy said. "It isn't." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, one of the bikers was moving across the yard toward the scorched concrete pad, doing something with a measuring tape that Dorothy couldn't quite interpret from the kitchen window. "What's he doing?" she said. Rourke glanced out. "Hawk. He's a contractor when he's not riding, probably sizing the slab." He looked back at Dorothy. "We'll put up a new shed before we leave, if that's all right." Dorothy blinked. "That's not necessary." "No, but it's what we've got to offer right now." He said it simply. "New shed's easier than the rest of this." Dorothy looked at him, at this man she had known for less than 18 hours, who had appeared from the dark to help fight a fire, and was now sitting at her kitchen table, reading documents about drug distribution networks and the death of his son. She thought about 41 years of emergency rooms, about the 1,000 ways people arrived broken, and the 1,000 ways they gathered the pieces, about the particular kind of repair that happened not in the quiet recovery of individual healing, but in the collision of one person's wreckage with another person's willingness to stay. "All right," she said. "Thank you. Thank me when Briggs is in a cell," Rourke said. He closed the folder. "Tell me about the hearing. Everything you know about the judge assigned." Dorothy poured fresh coffee and told him. Today in this book, that night, the second night since the fire, Dorothy stood on the back porch and looked at the meadow where the Iron Reapers had moved their camp. She could see the glow of their fire through the tree line, steady and controlled, the fire of men who knew how to build one that didn't spread. She could hear very faintly the low murmur of voices, and once briefly, the sound of someone's laughter. She had called her daughter at 7, the usual call, had said nothing about the shed, or the brake line, or the bikers camped in her meadow. Her daughter was 51 and had enough to carry, and would come thundering down from Cincinnati with entirely understandable alarm, if she knew, and Dorothy was not ready for that particular complication yet. She would tell her. When there was something concrete to tell, when the situation had a shape that could be communicated without the telling itself becoming a crisis. She thought about what Rourke had said about his son. She thought about Cassie Mercer's careful, flat, terrified documentation. She thought about Earl Briggs, whom she'd met twice, once at a county commission meeting and once at the clinic's charity drive in May. He was a large man, cordial in the way of men who never needed to be more than cordial, because they operated in an environment structured to protect them. He had the eyes of a man who had been safe so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be threatened, which was the same as saying he had forgotten how to calculate risk, which was a vulnerability if you knew how to use it. Dorothy was beginning to understand how to use it. She went inside and made a list. The list was not about the hearing, though the hearing was on it. It was about sequence, about the order in which things needed to happen for the outcome to be what it needed to be, which was not just a protective order for Cassie Mercer, but the dismantling of the structure that had made Cassie's situation possible in the first place. That required Cassie's testimony to be heard by someone with the authority and the independence to act on it. That required going above Briggs's level of influence. That required Dorothy was increasingly certain the federal level. She wrote the FBI field office number for Louisville at the top of the list. She wrote Vince Rourke's name below it, then stopped and looked at what she'd written. She had known this man for less than a day. She added it to her list anyway. The call came the next morning just before 7. It was Wade Mercer's number, which she recognized because it had called her 3 times since she'd filed the complaint, and she had not answered any of those times. She answered this one. "Mrs. Callahan." His voice was careful, controlled. The voice of a man making an official call, not a threatening one, though the difference in this county was largely procedural. "Mr. Mercer," she said. She was at the stove. She did not take her hand off the spatula. "I wanted to reach out as a courtesy." He paused. "I understand you had some trouble at your property the other night. A fire." "I did." "That's a shame. These old properties, the outbuildings, especially the electrical, can be dangerous. You should have it looked at." "The fire marshal's report should be complete by the end of the week," Dorothy said pleasantly. "I've requested it formally. I understand they're treating the origin as suspicious." A brief pause. "I just wanted you to know that as a member of the Harlan County Sheriff's Department, I take the safety of county residents very seriously, especially those who are living alone." "That's very thoughtful. And I wanted to say," his voice shifted slightly, dropping the official register, "that whatever disagreement there might be between us, there's no reason for anyone to get hurt." Dorothy flipped the egg in the pan. "I agree completely, so long as we understand each other." "I understand you perfectly, Mr. Mercer," she said. "Have a good morning." She hung up and stood at the stove for a moment. Her hands were steady. The egg finished cooking. She plated it, poured her coffee, and went out to the porch where Vince Rourke was standing at the railing with his own cup, having come down from the meadow in the early light. "Wade Mercer just called," she said, sitting down. "Warned me very politely that it would be a shame if anyone got hurt." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "He called you directly?" "Yes. Which means he's not as careful as Briggs would want him to be." Rourke turned from the railing. Scared men get sloppy. That was my read. Dorothy ate a bite of egg. He's not stupid. He's frightened. Those aren't the same thing, but they produce some of the same behaviors. You record the call. Dorothy patted the phone in her pocket. I've been recording every call since the break line. Kentucky is a one-party consent state. Rourke looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite identify. It had something of the look she'd seen on patients in the ER, the ones who arrived in bad shape, and looked up from the gurney and recognized with a relief that came out as pure exhaustion that whoever had caught them knew what they were doing. Mrs. Callahan, he said. Dorothy. He said it once as though setting it in place. We need to talk about what happens between now and that hearing, because I don't think Mercer and Briggs are going to wait for it. Dorothy set down her fork. No, she said, neither do I. The morning light was coming up gold and hard over the Kentucky hills, and in the meadow beyond the tree line, the Iron Reaper's fire had burned down to coals, and somewhere in a house 8 miles down the road, a frightened, sloppy man was realizing that the 72-year-old woman he'd underestimated was not going to stop, and that the men camped on the ridge behind her property were not going away. Dorothy Callahan picked up her fork and finished her breakfast. There was a great deal of work to do. The second escalation came on Thursday. Dorothy was at the county health clinic doing her 2-day-a-week intake assessments when the call came from her neighbor, Frank Aldridge, who farmed the property to the north and was the kind of man who noticed things without being asked to and reported them without editorializing. He said that there was a county vehicle on Prentice Road parked in the turnout half a mile from her driveway, and that it had been there since 9 in the morning, and it was now noon, and the man in it hadn't gotten out once. Sheriff's Department markings? Dorothy asked. Yep. Can't see the number from the road. All right, Frank. Thank you. She finished her shift. She called Rourke from the clinic parking lot. I know, he said before she got through the second sentence. Hawk spotted him 2 hours ago from the ridge. We've been watching the watcher. He ran the plates on the vehicle when it arrived. Registered to the Harlan County Sheriff's Department fleet. It's not Mercer's assigned unit, so it's someone else. Someone Briggs sent, making sure you know you're being watched. Rourke paused. You want to go home? Dorothy looked at the clinic building, at the parking lot where her truck sat, with its repaired brake line at the Kentucky sky, doing what it did in August, which was glare with a flat, merciless brightness that left no shadows to hide in. I'm going home, she said, and I'm going to drive past that vehicle slowly so the man in it can see my face clearly. A pause. You want company. I want you to stay on the ridge and keep watching. I want to know if the vehicle follows me. Copy that. She drove home. The county vehicle was where Frank had described it. She slowed as she passed, not dramatically, just the natural deceleration of someone navigating a rural road, and she looked directly at the man in the driver's seat, who was in his 30s, in plain clothes, with the face of a man doing a job he'd been given without much enthusiasm. He looked back at her. She nodded a single small nod that said, I see you, and I'm not afraid of being seen, and drove on. The vehicle did not follow her. Rourke was in her yard when she arrived. He'd come down from the meadow on foot, which she was beginning to understand was how he preferred to move when he was thinking. He called it in when you passed, Rourke said. We could hear the radio. He said you made him. Whoever he called, they told him to sit tight. Briggs is documenting my movements, Dorothy said. Building something, either to discredit my testimony at the hearing or to justify some kind of action against me. She looked at the space where the shed had been. He moved too fast with the fire. That was emotion, not strategy. He's being more careful now. Which means he's thinking past the hearing, Rourke said. Yes. He thinks he can manage the hearing. The judge, possibly, or he thinks he can delay it long enough to make Cassie reconsider. Dorothy set her bag down on the porch step. That's the pressure point. Cassie is safe in Lexington, but she's not invincible to fear. If Briggs can create enough uncertainty about whether this hearing will go anywhere, whether the protective order will hold even if it's granted, Whether the larger case will ever actually be built, he might convince her that cooperation is more dangerous than silence. Can he get to her in Lexington? He doesn't have jurisdiction. But jurisdiction is a technical concept, and fear is an emotional one. She sat down on the step. I need to talk to her. I've been calling every other day, but I need to go see her. Before the hearing. I'll come with you, Rourke said. Dorothy looked up at him, this man standing in her yard in the August afternoon. The gray beard and the road-worn cut, and the eyes that were always calculating the horizon. You don't need to do that. You just drove slowly past a man who's surveilling you on behalf of a corrupt sheriff, he said. You're not driving to Lexington alone. Dorothy considered this. She had been taking care of herself for 7 years, had been handling complicated and sometimes dangerous situations for 41 years before that, and was not in the habit of accepting protection she didn't need. But she was also, as she had told Rourke, a woman who made tactical assessments, and the tactical assessment was that going to Lexington alone was a risk she didn't need to take. All right, she said. Saturday morning. Chapter 9, Friday brought Hawk with lumber. Dorothy came out at 8 to find him in the space behind the house, measuring the concrete slab with the precision of a man who measured things for a living when he wasn't measuring other things. He was younger than most of the others, maybe mid-30s, with a quiet face and hands that were never still, always moving over surfaces, assessing structure. I can do a 12 by 16 on the existing slab, he said without preamble when she came over. Replace what you lost. Better ventilation than the original from what I can see of the foundation. You don't need to do this, Dorothy said. Hawk looked at her with the patient expression of a man accustomed to that response. Already ordered the materials. They'll be here by noon. He went back to his measurements. Dorothy stood watching him for a moment. What did you do before contracting? She said. Army. Combat engineer. Explains the measurement approach. He glanced at her briefly. Almost a smile. Yes, ma'am. She left him to it and went back inside to call her lawyer in Louisville. The lawyer's name was Patricia Holden, a family law specialist who had been following the Cassie Mercer case with the focused attention of a woman who understood exactly what it meant when protective order hearings got delayed in counties where the judiciary and the law enforcement were on speaking terms. Patricia had news. It was not good news. The hearing's been reassigned, Patricia said. New judge, Calvin Moss. Dorothy sat down. Who is Calvin Moss? Circuit Court. He's been on the bench 14 years. His record on domestic violence cases is not strong. He has a pattern of continuing hearings requesting additional documentation, finding procedural reasons to delay. Patricia paused. He's also the son-in-law of Thomas Mercer, Wade Mercer's father. Correct. Dorothy closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Then she opened them. Can we challenge the reassignment? On what grounds? It went through standard procedure. We'd need documented evidence of improper influence. I'll work on that. What are our options if Moss does what you expect? We appeal immediately and simultaneously file with the State Judiciary Oversight Board. It slows everything down, but it creates a paper trail. Patricia's voice was careful. Dorothy, I want to say something, and I want you to hear it as professional advice and not pessimism. Go ahead. Briggs has more tools than we do at the county level. We've known that from the beginning. If this is going to go somewhere, it needs to go federal. It needs to be out of his reach before it matters. I know, Dorothy said. I'm working on that. She was working on that. She had been working on it since the morning she'd found the brake line cut, had been building toward the phone call she hadn't made yet, the one that required more preparation than she'd had time for. The FBI call required a package. It required Cassie's documents and the overdose data, and the recorded call from Wade Mercer, and the fire marshal's report, and the surveillance log that Rourke's men had been keeping since Wednesday, noting the county vehicle's license plate and the times it was present, and the officer's radio communications they'd overheard from the ridge. She needed 2 more days. She was not sure she had 2 more days, but she had learned in 41 years of emergency medicine that you worked with what you had, and you moved as fast as the situation required. And no faster and no slower, because faster made errors, and slower made space for things to get worse. She hung up with Patricia and went to find Rourke. He was at the meadow's edge with two of his men looking at something on a topographic map spread over the hood of a truck. When she approached, he straightened and turned, and there was something in the way he did it, the immediate full attention that she had noticed about him before. He didn't manage his attention or portion it out. When he was with you, he was with you. She told him about the hearing reassignment, about Calvin Moss. He listened without interrupting. Then, how long to build the federal package? 2 days, maybe 3. And the hearing? 12 days. But if Moss continues it, which Patricia believes he will, it could be months. She looked at the map on the truck hood without really seeing it. The hearing isn't actually the critical path anymore. It's the federal referral. If I can get the package to the right person in the FBI Louisville field office before Briggs realizes what we're building, the hearing almost doesn't matter. You know someone at the field office. Not directly, but I know someone who does. She looked at him. Which is a conversation I need to have tomorrow in Lexington. Rourke folded the map. Then we leave early, he said, before the surveillance vehicle gets in position. Dorothy looked at him. You've thought about this already. Been thinking about it since yesterday. He didn't say it with any pride, just as a fact about how he spent his time. If I'm right about the Halcyon connection, this isn't just about Briggs protecting a corrupt deputy. It's a distribution network operating across multiple counties, and the sheriff's department is the protection mechanism for it. The FBI won't just be interested in Cassie's domestic violence case. They'll be interested in the whole architecture. That's what I'm hoping. He looked at her steadily. You understand that makes you a significant threat to a significant operation. I do. And you're not stopping. No, Dorothy said. I'm 72 years old, and I have spent 41 years watching what happens to people when the system that's supposed to protect them decides to look away instead. I am not going to be the person who looks away. She met his gaze. Are you? A long moment. No, Vince Rourke said. I'm not. In the meadow behind them, Hawk was framing the first wall of the new shed, his hammer striking a clean, regular rhythm against the August afternoon. Somewhere on Prentice Road, a county vehicle was probably parked in a turnout, documenting Dorothy's presence at home. And in Lexington, Cassie Mercer was sitting in her sister's apartment with 8 months of careful, terrified documentation that was about to become the foundation of something that would either bring down Earl Briggs's operation or bring down everyone who'd tried to stop it. Dorothy Callahan had made her choice a long time ago in a different county, in a different life, when she had first learned what it cost to do the right thing and had decided to pay it anyway. The choice had not changed. It had only found new terrain. The drive to Lexington on Saturday took 90 minutes on 2-lane roads that wound through the hills like they had been laid down by someone who believed the shortest distance between 2 points was an interesting question rather than a settled one. Dorothy drove. Rourke rode beside her in the cab of her truck, which she'd noticed he'd inspected before they left. Not ostentatiously, just a brief circuit of the vehicle with the attention of a man who checked things. 2 of his men followed on bikes at a distance that was close enough to be present and far enough to be unremarkable. They left at 5:30 in the morning, an hour before the county surveillance vehicle had been arriving at its spot on Prentice Road. You've been doing this a long time, Rourke said about 20 minutes out of town. He was looking at the road ahead. Doing what, specifically? Moving people, making arrangements for them, helping women who needed to get somewhere safely. Dorothy glanced at him. The clinic work, yes. Before the clinic, the ER. She adjusted her grip on the wheel. You saw things in the ER in a city hospital that you didn't look away from, or you did. I made my choice about that early. She paused. Louisville in the 80s and 90s was not a gentle city in terms of what came through our doors on a Friday night. I imagine not. They were quiet for a while. The hills scrolled past in the early light, the ridges going from black to purple to the flat green of August. And Dorothy drove the way she did most things with complete attention and no wasted motion. "Your son," she said. She had been debating whether to say it since the conversation in the kitchen. "What was his name?" Rourke was quiet for a moment. "Caleb." He said it simply, without decoration. He was 31. He'd had trouble with substances on and off for about 8 years. We thought he was doing better. Another pause. You always think they're doing better until they're not. Was he local to Floyd County? He was working there, roofing. He'd been clean 14 months when he died. Rourke's hands were flat on his knees, very still. The coroner said that toxicology showed fentanyl at a dose inconsistent with recreational use. Inconsistent, that was the word they used, meaning whoever pressed those pills made them too strong or inconsistently strong, so that a dose that might be survivable in one pill was lethal in the next. He looked out the window. Caleb had been careful. He knew his tolerance. He wasn't reckless. He paused. The pill killed him, not his choices. That's what I've spent 3 years trying to get someone to hear. Dorothy absorbed this. And no one investigated. The Floyd County Sheriff said it was an accidental overdose. Closed the case in 2 weeks. I hired a private investigator. The investigator found the same thing Cassie found, cash-moving vehicles visiting at night, a name that turned up on the supply side of at least 3 overdose cases in the region. He looked at her. Halcyon. Dorothy kept her eyes on the road. When did you find that name? 8 months ago. And you've been carrying it since. I've been waiting, he said, for the right moment, the right lever. You can't go at something like this sideways. You go at it wrong, the evidence disappears, and the witnesses recant, and another investigation gets closed in 2 weeks. He was quiet. And then your daughter, in your case, your granddaughter, grows up in a county where the men responsible for her father's death are still running the operation that killed him. Dorothy looked at him, then briefly reading his face. You came through here on purpose, she said. A pause. The Iron Reapers have run this circuit every year for 16 years. It passes through Harlan County because that's where the roads go. He said it carefully. But I've been coming through here with particular attention for about 18 months. Watching, learning the geography. He paused again. I didn't know about Cassie Mercer. I didn't know about you. But I had already identified Briggs as a person of interest by the time I saw your shed burning. Dorothy considered this for a long moment. The road bent, and she bent with it. Is there anything else I should know about what you've been doing? She said. The club has relationships with people in various law enforcement contexts, Rourke said. Not corrupt ones, the other kind. People who have their own reasons to want certain operations disrupted. He paused. One of those people is a federal agent. He's not currently on the Halcyon case because the Halcyon case doesn't officially exist yet, but he'd like it to exist. Dorothy nodded slowly. That's who I'm going to call from Lexington. We may be calling the same person, Rourke said. She looked at him again. He looked back. And in that look was the particular recognition of 2 people who had been working on the same problem from different directions and had arrived by different roads at the same door at the same time. Cassie Mercer opened the door of her sister's apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in East Lexington and looked at Dorothy and the large man standing slightly behind her and said, "Oh," in a tone that contained about 6 different emotions, most of them complicated. "This is Vince Rourke," Dorothy said. "He's been helping me." Cassie looked at Rourke's cut at the Iron Reaper's patch at the Sergeant-at-Arms designation. She had the careful face of a woman who had learned to read men quickly and accurately out of necessity. She looked for a long moment. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. The apartment was small and tidy in the way of temporary spaces that someone had tried to make bearable. Cassie's sister was at work. They sat in the small living room, Dorothy and Cassie on the couch, Rourke in the chair across from them, with his elbows on his knees, and his attention on Cassie, with the focused, patient quality that Dorothy had come to recognize as his default mode of listening. Cassie was 32, dark-haired, thin, in the way of women who had forgotten to eat for several months. Her right wrist, the one Dorothy had first seen at the clinic, was fully healed now. Her face was clear of the shadow that Dorothy had noticed at that first appointment, the particular flatness of a woman who had learned to keep her expression manageable. She looked frightened, but present, which was better. "They've moved the hearing to a judge who's connected to the Mercer family," Dorothy said without preamble, because Cassie deserved not to have this soften. "That means the protective order hearing is probably not going to go the way we want. The strategy has changed." Cassie's face went still. "Changed how? We need to go federal." Dorothy looked at her steadily. "I have documentation that suggests Wade's activities go significantly beyond the domestic situation. I believe you know more than you've told me." Cassie looked at her hands, at the healed wrist, then up at Dorothy. "If I tell you everything," she said carefully, "what happens to me?" "That depends on what everything is. But if what you know is what I think you know, you'd be considered a material witness in a federal investigation. Which means federal protection, not county protection. Not a judge who's related to your former husband's family." Cassie was quiet for a moment. She glanced at Rourke. He said, "My son died from the same supply chain your husband was part of. I'm not here to frighten you. I'm here because I've been trying to build a case for 3 years, and you may have the piece I'm missing." He paused. "But I won't sit here and tell you it's simple or safe. I'll tell you it's necessary. And I'll tell you that the people who can protect you are the ones who want this case to exist, not the ones who've been making sure it doesn't." Cassie looked at him for a long time. Then she got up and went to the bedroom and came back with a manila envelope that was thick with paper. She set it on the coffee table. "I didn't give these to Dorothy," she said. "I kept these separate. I didn't know if it was safe." She sat down again. "Wade's been receiving payments from a man named Curtis Boyle. Boyle runs an auto parts warehouse in Whitesburg, which is the legitimate business. The illegitimate business is distribution for something called Halcyon." She looked at Dorothy. "I know because I found a phone. A second phone Wade kept behind the furnace panel in the basement. I wrote down every contact and every text I could see before I put it back. It's in that envelope." Dorothy opened the envelope and looked at the first page. Then she passed it to Rourke. Rourke read it without a change of expression, which was the expression of a man containing something very large behind a very controlled surface. He set the page back on the table. "Curtis Boyle reports to someone above him," he said to Cassie. "Do you have a name? Anything Wade mentioned, or that appeared in the text?" Cassie hesitated then. "There was a name, Tatum. Just Tatum. No first name. Wade used it twice on calls he thought I wasn't near enough to hear." She paused. "He was always more frightened when he was talking to Tatum than to anyone else." Rourke was very still. "Tatum," he said, not as a question. "You know it," Dorothy said. "It's come up before. In the private investigation into Caleb's death," his voice was level. "Regional distributor. The person above Boyle, above Briggs, the person who determines where Halcyon moves and in what quantities." He set the page down. "If Cassie can testify to hearing that name in connection with Wade Mercer and Curtis Boyle, that's a link the investigators have been trying to establish for 2 years." Cassie listened to this. Her face had the quality Dorothy had seen on patients receiving a diagnosis, the moment when the information clicks into place and the landscape of your life rearranges itself around it. "Wade called me from Prentice Road," Dorothy said. "Thursday morning. I have the recording. He threatened me." She looked at Cassie. "He's frightened enough to make mistakes. That's useful. But it also means the timeline is moving faster than we planned." "How long do I have?" Cassie asked. "Before what?" "Before they try to get to me here." Dorothy looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at the window, at the ordinary East Lexington Street beyond it. "Briggs doesn't have a reach that extends cleanly into Fayette County," he said. "But Tatum might. And if Tatum knows Cassie exists and knows what she has, Lexington doesn't protect her." He looked at Cassie. "We need to get you to the federal level before that happens." "How fast?" "I have a contact," Rourke said. "FBI Louisville. He's expecting a call." He looked at Dorothy. "So do you, I think." Dorothy pulled her phone from her pocket. His name, Special Agent Roy Dalton, organized crime and drug enforcement. Dorothy turned the phone in her hand. The name Roy Dalton was on the list she'd made 3 days ago, written there by a Louisville contact who had said he was a good man who worked cases that other people closed. "He's who I was going to call," she said. "Then we call him together," Rourke said. Cassie looked between them. "Does he know about me?" "Not yet," Dorothy said. "But by the end of today he will." She looked at Cassie steadily. "This is going to be hard. I won't tell you otherwise. You'll have to tell your story in rooms full of strangers, and you'll have to tell it more than once. And some of those rooms will feel like the thing they're supposed to be protecting you from. I've seen this before. I've sat with women who've done this, and I know what it costs." She paused. "But I also know what it gives back." Cassie looked at her hands again, then at the envelope on the coffee table, then at the window where the Lexington morning was going about its ordinary business. "All right," she said. She said it quietly in the tone of a decision that had been building for a long time and had finally arrived at its moment. "All right, make the call." And the first chat. Roy Dalton answered on the second ring. He was a man of economy, Dorothy learned in the first 90 seconds. He asked 4 questions, got 4 answers, and said he'd be in Lexington by 6 that evening. He did not express surprise or enthusiasm or any particular emotion about being handed a connection he'd been working toward for 18 months. He said, "Copy that," twice, and "Send me the documentation to this address," and then was off the line. "That went well," Dorothy said. "He's been waiting for this call," Rourke said. "He's been working the Halcyon network from the federal side for the better part of 2 years. He has pieces. We have pieces. Put them together and the picture changes." The afternoon was long, the way afternoons were long, when the thing you were waiting for hadn't happened yet. Dorothy and Cassie went through the documentation together, organizing it, making sure the sequence was clear, that dates matched and details were internally consistent. Rourke sat near the window on the phone, intermittently speaking in the quiet half-sentences of someone coordinating something he didn't need to elaborate on because the people he was speaking with already understood the shape of it. At 4 in the afternoon, his phone rang, and he stepped into the kitchen to take it. Dorothy heard his voice drop lower, heard a single word that she couldn't make out, heard the specific quality of silence that followed it, which was the silence of bad news being absorbed. He came back to the living room. His face was the face of a man who had learned to keep his reactions internal, and was doing so now at some cost. "The surveillance vehicle moved," he said. "This morning, about an hour after we left, the same vehicle that's been sitting on your road went south, toward Lexington." Dorothy set down the paper she was holding. "They followed us," she said. "Not closely enough to track you. We would have seen it, but someone told them you were coming here." He looked at her. "Someone who knew your plan." The apartment felt different then. Still ordinary in all its surfaces, but with something underneath the ordinary that had changed temperature. Cassie had gone very still on the couch. "Frank Aldridge," Dorothy said slowly. "He called to tell me about the surveillance vehicle Thursday. I assumed he was being helpful." "Frank Aldridge might be being helpful," Rourke said, "or he might have made another call after yours." He paused. "It doesn't matter right now. What matters is that someone affiliated with Briggs knows you came to Lexington today. They don't know who you're meeting or what you have, but they know you left your property and came here. Which means Dalton gets here at 6 and there may be someone watching this building," Dorothy said. "Yes." Cassie looked at Dorothy. Something in her face had closed the way a door closes when a draft hits it, and Dorothy recognized the expression as the specific fear of a woman who had been calculating her exposure every day for 3 years and had just discovered the calculation wasn't complete. "I'm not going back to that apartment," Dorothy said to Cassie. "Whatever happens after today, I'm not going back to Prentice Road until this is done." Cassie looked at her. "Where will you go?" "That's what we need to figure out in the next 2 hours." She looked at Rourke. "Your men. Already moving. We've got 2 members in Lexington who can be here in 20 minutes. The rest of the club can be here from the Ridge camp in 90. He paused. But bringing 40 bikers to this address before Dalton arrives might not be the statement we want to make. Dorothy almost smiled. No, but 2 would be appropriate. She stood and went to the kitchen for water because she had learned that you function better when you stayed hydrated, even in situations that made it easy to forget. She stood at Cassie's sister's kitchen sink and looked out the window at the Lexington street and did the calculations she always did in emergency situations, which was not what she felt about what was happening, but what the situation needed in what order. The situation needed Dalton. It needed the documentation in Cassie's envelope. It needed Cassie to be calm enough to give a coherent account of what she'd seen and heard. It needed Dorothy to be clear enough to present the complete picture of what had happened on Prentice Road and what it connected to. What it did not need was panic. What it did not need was the kind of rushed decision that used up the options before the options were fully understood. She went back to the living room. Rourke was still near the window, but had shifted his angle, she noticed, so that he could see both the street below and the apartment door simultaneously. "I need to ask you something," she said to him, "and I want an honest answer. I'll do my best. This federal agent, Dalton, you trust him?" Rourke considered this with the care of a man who understood it wasn't a simple question. "I trust his interest in the case. I trust that he wants Tatum and Halcyon shut down and that he's been trying to do that with inadequate information for 2 years. I trust that we have what he needs." He paused. "I trust that he's not connected to Briggs or to anyone in Briggs's orbit." Another pause, smaller. "I trust him to do his job. Whether his job moves fast enough is a different question." "It needs to move fast," Dorothy said. "Cassie's in Lexington, but she's not invisible. And whatever Briggs is planning for the hearing in 12 days, it's going to escalate if he finds out we've gone to the FBI. "When he finds out," Rourke said. "Not if." "When?" "Yes. Then we make sure that when he finds out the case is already too far along for him to interfere." Rourke looked at her directly. "That's why Dalton gets everything today. Not just the introduction. Everything. The full package, documented and logged in federal hands, so that even if something happens to us, the case exists." Dorothy looked at him. "Something happening to us. I've been doing this long enough to know that the point where the operation gets dangerous isn't when you start. It's when the people you're exposing realize you're close enough to matter." He said it without drama. "We're at that point." Dorothy nodded. She was not afraid exactly. She had not been afraid of dying since Ray died, which had rearranged her relationship to the concept in ways she'd never fully articulated. What she had instead of fear was a very clear-eyed awareness of consequence, which was more useful. "Then let's make sure it counts," she said. Roy Dalton arrived at 6:15, which was 15 minutes later than he'd said, and suggested he'd been managing something on his way, which he confirmed obliquely by saying only that he'd come through a roundabout route. He was in his early 50s, lean, with the close-cropped gray of a man who'd stopped caring about hair some years ago, and the particular quality of attention that Dorothy associated with people who had spent careers building cases out of fragments and had learned to collect everything. He shook Dorothy's hand. He shook Rourke's hand with the quality of two people who had been at the edge of each other's awareness for some time and were finally in the same room. He sat down across from Cassie and looked at her for a moment. "You've been keeping documentation since January," he said. "Yes," Cassie said. That took courage. He said it simply not as a compliment, but as an assessment. Then he opened his notebook. "Tell me everything from the beginning," Cassie told him. She told it well with the flat precision of her written notes translated into spoken testimony, clear and sequential, and anchored in specific details, dates and times, and the description of the second phone behind the furnace panel, and the name Tatum, spoken on calls Wade believed she couldn't hear. She told it without embellishment, which Dalton received without interruption. Dorothy watched him take notes. Rourke watched the window. When Cassie finished, Dalton looked at the envelope, looked at the additional documents Dorothy had assembled, looked at the recording of Wade's call. He wrote several things in his notebook. Then he looked up. "The hearing on the 18th, he said. "Don't go to it." Dorothy looked at him. "I mean that as a strategic recommendation," Dalton said. "The hearing is now a secondary front. If Moss is compromised, going to the hearing tells Briggs exactly how much you have before we're in a position to act on it. What I want is for you to let the hearing continue. Let Moss do what he's going to do, and let that become part of the obstruction case." He looked at Dorothy. "Can your attorney document the procedural interference for the record?" "She already is." "Good. I'm going to need 2 weeks, maybe 3. He looked at Cassie. "You can't stay here." "I know," Cassie said. "I'm going to arrange protective accommodation in Louisville. Federal facility. No connection to the Lexington address." He looked at Rourke. "Your club." "We can keep the pressure on the county end," Rourke said. "Make sure Briggs is spending his attention looking at us instead of looking for where Cassie went." Dalton looked at him for a moment. "I'd prefer you didn't do anything that creates criminal liability." "I'd prefer that too," Rourke said. A pause. "But your people stay available." "We're on a circuit that runs through eastern Kentucky every year," Rourke said. "We go where the roads go." Dalton almost smiled. He looked at Dorothy. "You?" "Yes. You've put together an extraordinarily clean evidentiary package for someone outside law enforcement." "I was a nurse for 41 years, Dorothy said. "In emergency medicine, you learn to document what you see at the time you see it in language that will still be accurate and useful when you're standing in front of a committee 6 months later explaining why you made a particular decision." She looked at him steadily. This seemed analogous. Dalton wrote something in his notebook. "You go back to Prentice Road tonight." "No. Rourke's men have the property covered, but going back before you have what you need seems like the wrong signal to send." She looked at Rourke. "Can you arrange something?" "Already done," he said. "We've got a place." Dorothy nodded. She had known on some level, since she'd woken up Thursday morning with the brake line cut, and the full understanding of what she'd set in motion, that there was a point past which the ordinary framework of her daily life, the house and the clinic and the morning coffee on the porch, would need to give way to something else temporarily. She had not rushed toward that point, but here it was. "All right," she said to Dalton. "What do you need from me in the next 72 hours?" He told her. It was a significant list. Dorothy took it without writing it down because she had never needed to write down what she needed to do. She had a good memory kept well, and the list went into it cleanly. "We'll be in contact," Dalton said. He looked at Cassie once more, a long, assessing look. "You did the right thing," he said. "All 3 of you." He left. The apartment settled back into its ordinary quiet. Dorothy looked at Rourke. "The place you arranged," she said. "Club members' property, about 40 miles from here, rural, off the main routes." He looked at her. "Comfortable enough." "I don't need comfort," Dorothy said. "I need a kitchen and a phone signal." "You'll have both." Cassie was looking at the space where Dalton had been sitting. Her face had the expression of someone who had just jumped from a height and was still in the air, not yet having felt the landing. "Is it real now?" she said quietly. "Does it actually happen?" Dorothy sat down beside her. "It happens," she said. "It's going to be hard, and it's going to feel like it's taking too long, and there will be moments when it seems like nothing is moving. That's how these things go." She looked at Cassie directly. "But it happens, I promise you that." Cassie nodded. She reached out and took Dorothy's hand and held it for a moment, the way people held onto things that were solid when everything else was in motion. Outside, the Lexington evening was settling into itself, ordinary and unhurried, and 3 of Rourke's men were positioned at intervals that covered every approach to the building, and Roy Dalton was in a federal vehicle making calls that would begin to move the pieces of a 2-year case into their final positions. Dorothy Callahan held Cassie Mercer's hand and thought about the work still ahead, and about the particular quality of momentum that existed when the right pieces finally came together in the right order, and about a boy named Caleb who had been careful and had died anyway because someone had decided that the county was theirs to exploit. She thought about being useful. That was, as it had always been enough. The place Rourke had arranged was a farm property 43 miles northwest of Lexington, owned by a club member named Bernard Whitfield, who was in his late 60s and had the patient, particular courtesy of a man who had lived alone for many years and had thought carefully about how to treat visitors. He met them at the end of a gravel lane with a flashlight, and no unnecessary questions showed Dorothy and Cassie to a guest room that had clean sheets and a window that looked out onto a dark pasture, and told them breakfast was at 7 if they wanted it. Dorothy wanted it. She slept 5 hours, which was very good for her. She woke at 5 and went to the kitchen and found Rourke already there with coffee made, sitting at the table with a topographic map and a notebook. 2 of his men were visible through the window, moving along the fence line at the property edge, with the unhurried regularity of a patrol. Another was at the end of the lane. She had not asked them to do this and did not need to comment on it. She poured coffee and sat down across from him. "The overdose data," she said. "I want to go back to the county figures." He slid the folder across the table. She had brought it in her bag the way she brought everything she might need, not from anxiety, but from 41 years of professional habit. She opened it and looked at the numbers again in the morning quiet. The cluster of fatalities in the southwestern corner of the county had drawn her attention when she'd first compiled the data 3 weeks ago. 7 overdose deaths in an 18-month period in an area that covered 3 small communities, totaling perhaps 2,000 people. The rate was far above the county average, which was itself elevated. She had marked it at the time as a distribution endpoint, the place where supply met the most concentrated demand. "Whitfield County is adjacent," she said. "Yes. The Whitfield County overdose numbers are similar. Not identical, but similar in their shape. The slope of increase." She traced the line on her printout. "If Tatum is the regional distributor, the territory probably doesn't follow county lines." "It follows supply routes," Rourke said. "The roads that connect the warehouse in Whitesburg to the distribution points." He turned the topographic map toward her. "Curtis Boyle's warehouse is here. These roads are the natural arteries. Harlan, Leslie, Whitfield, Floyd. All counties where we've documented elevated mortality over the past 4 years." "Floyd County," Dorothy said. "Yes." She looked at the map. "At the web of 2-lane roads moving through the hills. When you've been coming through here on the circuit, these routes, we go through them all, every year." His voice was quiet, controlled. "I've been counting without intending to for 3 years now. The towns where the pharmacies have the naloxone locked behind the counter because the demand is constant. The communities where the volunteer fire department does more overdose reversals than fire responses." He looked at the map. "I've been counting, and I couldn't do anything about the count until I had a handle to pull." "Cassie's documents are the handle," Dorothy said. "Yes." "Caleb was one number in a cluster," Dorothy said. She said it carefully, not to reduce him, but to name what she'd understood. "You know that." "I know that." He looked at the map. "That doesn't make the number smaller." "No, it makes it larger." She looked at him steadily. "One number becomes a pattern, becomes an architecture, becomes something you can show to a federal agent and say, this is the shape of it, and this is the source of it, and this is what has to stop." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "You've done this before. Made the individual case into the systemic one. In the ER in Louisville in the 80s. She closed the folder. "There was a period when we were seeing a particular injury pattern in women who came in from a specific part of the city. Injuries that were documented as domestic coded a certain way closed. I started tracking it. Not officially, just personally, the way you track something because you can't stop seeing it." She paused. "It took 2 years to build a picture that anyone with authority would look at. By the time they looked, 17 women had died in that catchment area. I counted them the way you counted the towns." Rourke looked at her. "The counting is how you hold on to why it matters," Dorothy said. "That's what I've found. You don't let the number become abstract. You keep counting because each number is a person. And the person is the reason the whole thing is worth whatever it costs. She looked at the window at the morning coming up pale and clear over Whitfield's pasture. "Caleb," she said, "tell me something about him. Not about how he died, about who he was." Rourke looked at his coffee, then at the pasture. "He could fix anything," he said. "Mechanical, electrical. You handed Caleb a broken thing, and he took it apart in his head before he even touched it. Understood the structure of it." A pause. "He was terrible at asking for help with anything that wasn't mechanical. That's a thing I should have caught earlier." He was quiet for a moment. "He laughed too loud, always too loud. I used to give him hell about it when he was a kid." He looked at the table. "I'd give a lot to hear that laugh right now." Dorothy nodded. She didn't say anything because there was nothing to say to that, and she knew it. They sat in the early morning quiet for a while, just two people with their coffee and their separate loads, which were heavy but not crushing, which was the state that meant you were still standing and still capable of doing what needed to be done. The next 11 days had the quality of time that moved in two registers, simultaneously very slow in the waiting and very fast in the accumulating. Dalton checked in every 48 hours, his calls brief and informational, logging what the investigation had confirmed and what it still needed. Cassie was moved to Louisville on the third day, a federal facility that Dorothy was told was comfortable, and which Cassie confirmed in a brief call was, "Fine, it's fine, I just want this to be over." Dorothy told her it was nearly over, and said it with enough conviction that she hoped it landed that way. She stayed at the Whitfield farm. She did not return to Prentice Road. She called Frank Aldridge twice. Both times she gave him information that was plausible but imprecise about her whereabouts. And both times she noted what happened in the county shortly after. The second call produced a county vehicle on a road that corresponded to the vague direction she described. She was sorry about Frank Aldridge, who had been a decent neighbor, but she was not surprised. In a county where Earl Briggs had been sheriff for 11 years, decent men sometimes made choices they didn't fully think through, because the pressure to make them was built into the air. She told Dalton about Aldridge on the next check-in. He noted it without comment, which meant he would deal with it in whatever sequence it fit. Rourke was at the farm most days. Not constantly. He moved between the farm and the circuit, the club's annual run, continuing through the Eastern Kentucky Loop, the members rotating through, so that some were always in the immediate area, while others covered the broader territory. It was the kind of organization that ran itself, Dorothy came to understand, built around a principle of distributed responsibility that meant Rourke's presence wasn't required for everything, but was available when it was needed. He was a quiet presence. That was the primary quality she'd identified about him across these days of close proximity. Not passive, not withdrawn, just fundamentally uninsistent, moving through the spaces of the farm and the conversations and the logistical problem-solving without the particular quality of pressure that some men generated. The sense that their presence was itself a demand on the surrounding space. She appreciated it. She was also aware in the precise diagnostic way of a person who had spent 40 years reading what people communicated without intending to, that the quiet was working on something beneath its surface. That Vince Rourke was a man carrying a question he hadn't yet asked. It came on the 8th day. They were on the porch in the early evening, the Kentucky dark coming up soft and gradual, the way it did in August. The pasture going from green to gray to the deep indigo that preceded full night. He had brought 2 mugs of the coffee she'd taken to making strong enough to stand a spoon in, and they were sitting in the wooden chairs Bernard Whitfield kept on his porch for exactly this kind of evening. "Louisville General," Rourke said. "Trauma Unit, 1994. Dorothy set her mug down. "It was a motorcycle accident," he said. "September. A man came in on a Friday night. Blunt trauma, internal bleeding. They operated for 6 hours. The surgeon told his wife afterward that he should have died and didn't because of the work the triage nurse did in the first 15 minutes. He looked at his hands. The nurse's name was on the chart. He tried to find her afterward to thank her. She'd left the hospital by then retired, and the administration wouldn't give out contact information. He looked at Dorothy. The man's name was Vincent Rourke. The nurse's name was Dorothy Callahan. Dorothy was very still. "You've been trying to find me since 1994, she said, intermittently. The way you try to find something when you don't have enough information and the world is large." He looked at the pasture. "I stopped looking about 10 years ago. Figured I'd miss the window." A pause. "Then I came around the bend on Prentice Road and there was a shed burning and a woman standing in front of it with a garden hose." Dorothy picked up her mug and held it in both hands. She was doing something that was not quite remembering, because in 41 years of emergency medicine, the individual cases blurred at the edges, became part of a continuous stream. What you retained were the ones that had snapped into focus because something had been acute, because the decision tree had narrowed to a single point. September 1994, a motorcycle accident on a Friday night. She had a sense, not a specific memory, but a sense of it, the shape of the work. "The first 15 minutes, she said. "Yes, I don't always remember," she said. "The individual cases. I want you to understand that's not about the weight of them. It's about the volume. 41 years of Friday nights." "I understand that, but I remember the work," she said. "What needed doing in that window. I've always known what needed doing." Rourke looked at her. The porch light made the planes of his face clear and the damage on it visible, the scar tracing the cheekbone, the evidence of a life that had been physical and not always kind. "I'm not telling you this to create a debt," he said carefully. "You don't owe me anything for being good at your job. I know that. I'm telling you because I've been sitting across a kitchen table from you for 8 days while you rebuild the case that might finally account for my son's death. And you didn't know that the person you saved in 1994 grew up to be the man you're working with now." He paused. "It seemed like something you should know." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. "The person I saved in 1994, she said, grew up to be a man who showed up to my property in the middle of the night and picked up a shovel." She paused. "I'll take that." The porch was quiet. In the pasture something moved, a deer or a coyote, briefly visible at the fence line and then gone. The dark was full up now, and the stars over Whitfield's farm were the dense, unobstructed stars of rural Kentucky that city people forgot existed. "Thank you," Rourke said. He said it simply the way you said something that had been waiting a long time and was finally being set down. "Thank you," Dorothy said. They sat on the porch until the coffee was gone. "Today's meant to you." The call from Dalton came on the 11th day at 6 in the morning. Dorothy answered it on the first ring. "We're moving," he said. "Today. I need you and Rourke in Louisville by noon." She was out of bed and dressed before the call ended. The FBI Louisville field office was a building designed to be unremarkable, and it succeeded. Dorothy and Rourke arrived at 11:40, were met at the entrance by a young agent who didn't introduce herself, and walked them through a series of hallways at a pace that suggested efficiency rather than haste, and were deposited in a conference room where Roy Dalton was standing over a table spread with documents and photographs, and the specific, organized chaos of an investigation in its late stage of assembly. Cassie was already there. She was sitting at the far end of the table with her hands around a paper cup of coffee and the composed, carefully controlled expression of a woman who had made her decision and was living inside it. She looked at Dorothy when she came in, and what passed between them was the specific communication of two people who had been through something together and didn't need words for the acknowledgement. Dalton looked up. "Good. We have a window, and we're using it." He gestured to the chairs and kept talking, the economy of his speech even more pronounced than usual, the machine of him running at full capacity. "The warrant came through at 4 this morning. Federal warrant covering Curtis Boyle's warehouse, Earl Briggs's office, and 2 properties associated with the individual known as Tatum." He looked at Dorothy. "Tatum's real name is Gerald Foss. He's a logistics operator based in Pikeville, who has managed distribution for 3 separate drug networks over the past decade, moving into fentanyl compounds about 5 years ago. He built Halcyon from the distribution side, sourcing the supply and managing the territory. Rourke was very still beside Dorothy. "Foss," he said. "You know the name. My private investigator mentioned a Foss in Floyd County, connected to the overdose cluster. The investigator said the connection was tenuous." Rourke's voice was level. "It wasn't tenuous, no." Dalton looked at him for a moment with the focused respect of one professional for another doing related work. "The Floyd County deaths, including your son's, are part of the documented territory. Foss will face charges that encompass them." The room was quiet for a moment. Dorothy watched Rourke absorb this. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things from the inside out, containing the impact and processing it somewhere that didn't show. But she could see it in the set of his jaw, the quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness, more compressed, like something held under pressure. "How does today work?" Dorothy said, redirecting. Because the work was what mattered right now, and she knew it, and she suspected Rourke needed it to matter right now. "Arrests on the warehouse in Briggs's office happened simultaneously at 2 this afternoon," Dalton said. "Foss is being picked up in Pikeville at the same time by a separate team. Wade Mercer will be arrested at his current location, which we've had surveilled for 72 hours. Dalton looked at Dorothy and Cassie. "I'm going to need both of you available for formal statements this afternoon. What you give us today, added to the documented evidence and Cassie's prior statement, is the foundation the prosecution builds on." "The hearing," Cassie said, "the September 18th hearing, is now irrelevant as a county proceeding. The federal case supersedes it. Judge Moss's jurisdiction over the protective order question ends when the federal case is filed." Dalton paused. "You're protected by federal witness protection protocols from this point forward, meaning Briggs and Mercer and anyone associated with their operation is legally prevented from contacting, approaching, or threatening you. Any violation of that is a federal crime." Cassie sat with that, the paper cup in her hands, the fluorescent light of the conference room, the ordinary bureaucratic furniture of a building that was in this moment the mechanism through which 8 months of terrified, careful documentation was going to become something permanent and legal, and much larger than any of them had managed alone. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay. Habit will be many more different in a mini process. What are building on the brand will be good at impact someplace. In effect of the general subsidy is expected by the appropriate area today, which will do to build a term in we're leading a dish. Appropriate area to design their calm before tremendous states program, for promise investigated, and nother well have living in individually, and remove the type of a term. It's completely to build a term on the appropriate, it has a similarity objections from no to medical fission. Proposal in nothing build. It has an easily deep to mexify of desire this many program. It is no to easily see, a then so. Then we have too many of one will strict in an invest, in another well may the build, it is no carbly depete, of termendical, fundum shoulderses, in anywhere, that we have build. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Dorothy Callahan sat in an interview room in the Louisville field office and told Roy Dalton everything she had documented and observed from the first intake appointment with Cassie Mercer in June, to the phone call with Wade Mercer, to the fire and the surveillance vehicle, and the meeting in Lexington, and the documents and the name Tatum spoken on calls in a back bedroom in Harlan County. She told it in the order that made evidentiary sense. She presented the recordings where they were relevant. She was calm, clear, precise, and thorough because 41 years of emergency medicine had trained her to give the facts in the order that allowed the person receiving them to act on them most effectively, and that was what this was. Dalton asked good questions. She gave good answers. They were in the room for 2 hours and 20 minutes. When she came out, Rourke was in the hallway. "Done," he said. "Done." She leaned against the wall, not from exhaustion, but from the particular release of having set a thing down after carrying it a long distance. Cassie, still in with the prosecution team. She'll be another hour. He handed her a cup of coffee. Briggs was arrested at 2:03, Mercer at 2:11. Boyle's warehouse is secured. Foss is in custody in Pikeville. Dorothy held the coffee. All at once, so none of them had time to communicate or destroy anything. He looked at the hallway. Dalton's team has been building this for 2 years. They knew what they were doing. Dorothy nodded. She thought about what Dalton had said. They had pieces. We had pieces. She thought about Cassie writing in her careful script in a house where she'd learned to be invisible. About Dorothy writing the number on the back of a clinic card and sliding it across a table without saying anything. About Rourke coming down the ridge in the dark toward a burning shed, because that was what you did. All the pieces. How long they'd been moving toward this room. The county, she said. The people in those towns. The overdose rates don't fix overnight, Rourke said. I know that. Taking out the supply chain disrupts distribution, but doesn't address the need. There's a lot of work still. Yes, she looked at him. Are you going to do it? He looked at her. Do what? The work still. The advocacy. The pressure on recovery resources, on treatment funding, on the county health infrastructure. She paused. You've been counting towns for 3 years. You know the geography of it. You have an organization with a presence across the circuit. She paused again. And you have something that Dalton and the prosecutors don't have, which is the reason it matters from the inside. Rourke was quiet for a moment. You're recruiting me, he said. I'm identifying what's in front of you. She looked at him steadily. You don't have to do it alone. The clinic where I volunteer has connections to the State Health Board. Patricia Holden, my lawyer, has worked on the legislative side of domestic violence funding for 20 years. There are people who know how to apply what's just happened to something that lasts beyond the criminal case. You're building something, he said. I'm always building something, Dorothy said. It's what I do when I'm not doing the immediate thing. He looked at her for a long moment. The fluorescent hallway light did him no favors, casting everything flat and bright, but in that light his face was readable in a way that outdoor light and moving situations weren't. He was doing the calculations she'd watched him do across the past weeks, the one where he weighed what was possible against what was needed and measured the distance between them against what he had to offer. All right, he said. Yes, Dorothy nodded. She drank the coffee. Down the hallway, a door opened, and Cassie's voice was briefly audible. Not the words, but the tone, which was steady, which was more than enough. They drove back to Harlan County that evening. Dorothy Rourke and 2 of his men who rode behind them in the way that had become ordinary over the past weeks. The Kentucky hills came up dark against the sunset sky, the ridges in silhouette, and the 2-lane roads moved through them in their unhurried way. Dorothy called her daughter from the truck. This time she told her most of it. Her daughter, whose name was Ellen, and who had her mother's directness, and somewhat less of her patience for delayed disclosure, was quiet for a long moment after Dorothy finished. Then she said, You've been doing this for 3 weeks, and you didn't tell me. I'm telling you now, Mom. Ellen, a pause. Are you safe? Yes. Is it over? The immediate part is over. The rest takes time. What rest? Dorothy looked at the dark hills. The work that comes after, she said. There's always work that comes after. Ellen was quiet again. Then, Are you coming to Cincinnati for Thanksgiving? I always come for Thanksgiving. Okay. A pause. Okay, Mom. Dorothy smiled. I love you, Ellen. I love you too. Call me more. She hung up and sat with the phone in her lap for a moment. Outside the truck window, the county was going about its evening lights in windows. A gas station lit up bright at a crossroads. The ordinary texture of a place that had just had something taken out of it and didn't yet fully know. Your daughter, Rourke said. Yes. She took it well. She took it the way she takes things. Directly. Dorothy put the phone in her bag. She's mine. They drove through the county seat through the main street, with its buildings and its courthouse that would shortly have a vacancy at the sheriff's level, Through the side streets where the volunteers who'd been working with the insufficient resources they'd always had were already doing the work of a night that didn't know anything had changed yet. The change would come. It would come slowly in the way of systemic things, but it would come. Dorothy looked at the courthouse as they passed it. She had sat in that building twice. Once at a commission meeting about road maintenance, and once at a charity event where Earl Briggs had stood at the podium and given a speech about community safety. He had been cordial and specific about his record, specific in the way of people who have pre-answered the questions they're worried about. She had listened and noted. She had not been afraid of him. She was not afraid now. She was something else, something closer to the way you felt at the end of a very long shift, when the thing you'd been managing had resolved, and the resolution was not perfect. It never was. But the critical issue had been addressed, and the patient was stable. That was the word, stable. The county was going to be stable in a way it hadn't been, and stability was the precondition for everything that happened afterward. Prentice Road was dark and quiet when they turned onto it. Rourke's men had been holding the property while she was gone, and the evidence of this was the motorcycles parked in her yard and the light on in her kitchen window. Someone had left it on, not careless, but deliberate, the way you left a light on for someone who was coming back. Dorothy got out of the truck and stood in her yard for a moment. The air smelled like late August in eastern Kentucky, which was warm and dry and had the faint edge of the coming fall in it. The stars were the dense rural stars she'd come to consider her own. Bernard Whitfield's farm and the Louisville field office and the weeks of being somewhere else had sharpened her sense of this place as hers the way distance sometimes did. She was home. The next morning she made coffee and carried it to the back porch and looked at the concrete slab where the shed had been and at the new walls that had gone up in her absence because Hawk had kept at it. The framing was complete. The roof would be done in 2 days, he'd told her the night before. It would be better than the original in every structural way. Rourke came out with his own cup and stood at the railing. His men were breaking down the camp in the meadow, loading gear onto bikes, getting ready for the next leg of the circuit. The annual run continued, eastern Kentucky, and then western Virginia, and then down into Tennessee, the routes they'd ridden for 16 years. "When do you come back through?" Dorothy said. "Next year. Same time." He paused. "Unless there's a reason to come through sooner." She looked at him. He was looking at the meadow. "There's going to be a county commission meeting in October," she said, "about the sheriff's appointment process given the vacancy. And in November, there's a state health board meeting where someone needs to present the overdose data in the context of what the investigation uncovered. Make the case for targeted resources." "That sounds like a reason to come through sooner," Rourke said. "It does." He turned from the railing and looked at her with the direct quality that she'd come to understand as his version of saying something important. "The circuit's flexible," he said. "It goes where the roads go." Dorothy looked at this man, at the scar on his cheekbone, and the gray beard and the road-worn cut with its sergeant-at-arms patch. At the hands that had been so still on her kitchen table when she'd told him what the overdose data said and had stayed still through all of it, through the grief and the anger and the long, patient work of building something that couldn't be dismissed. At the man who had turned from the road toward a burning shed on a dark August night because that was what you did when you saw a problem and had a shovel. "I'll put coffee on October 15th, she said, 6 a.m. "I'll be here by 5:50, Rourke said. "At the people film my procedures since I method. When our judge as weathers the federal prosecution of Earl Briggs, Wade Mercer, Curtis Boyle, and Gerald Foss moved through the system with the pace of federal cases, which was not fast. It took 14 months from arrest to trial. During that time, Dorothy continued her work at the county health clinic. She joined the county commission's ad hoc committee on the sheriff's appointment process, which produced a candidate she considered acceptable. She presented the overdose data to the state health board in November, with Rourke beside her and Patricia Holden there for the legal context. And the result was the beginning of a funded treatment initiative that would be modest in its first year and would need to be fought for in every subsequent budget cycle. She knew that, she was prepared to fight. Cassie Mercer testified at trial in a Louisville federal courtroom on a Tuesday in October, 14 months after Roy Dalton had listened to her in her sister's apartment in Lexington. She wore a navy dress and sat in the witness box with the flat, careful precision of her written documentation translated into speech. And she answered every question put to her by the prosecution and the defense without hesitation and without drama. Dorothy sat in the gallery and watched. When Cassie stepped down from the box, she walked past the defense table where Wade Mercer sat in a suit that didn't fit him and looked at him for one moment with the expression of a woman who had decided definitively what she thought and had decided equally definitively that she didn't need to say it aloud. She walked out of the courtroom and through the lobby and down the courthouse steps and stood in the October sun with her eyes closed for a long moment. Dorothy came and stood beside her. "All right," Dorothy said. Cassie opened her eyes. "Yes," she said, "I'm all right." And she was. Not completely, not in the way of someone who had finished healing, because that kind of healing didn't have a finish date, but she was standing in the sun outside a courthouse, where the man who had spent 3 years convincing her she didn't matter was sitting inside, answering for it. And she was all right. Dorothy Callahan stood beside her and said nothing further, because nothing further was needed. The jury in the case of the United States versus Briggs, Mercer, Boyle, and Foss took 3 days. The verdicts came in on a Thursday morning. Guilty on all primary counts for each defendant. Briggs received 18 years, Mercer 16, Boyle 12. Foss, whose network had been the architecture that made the others possible, received 24. Dorothy heard about it in the garden, where she was turning over the beds for the winter. Her phone rang and Dalton's name appeared on the screen, and he said the 2 words that were the entire content of the call. "Guilty, all." Then he said, "Good work, Mrs. Callahan." Then he hung up. She stood in the garden in the late October sun with her gloves on her hands and the Kentucky hills going gold and rust around her, and said nothing aloud, but felt something in her chest that was not triumph and was not relief exactly, but was something she associated with the end of a long surgery, when the patient was stable and the indicators were good, and the work had been equal to what the situation required. She called Rourke. He answered immediately. "Heard," he said. "Guilty. All." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm on the circuit in Virginia this week. I'll come through on the weekend if that's all right." "That's all right." "Dorothy." "Yes. Thank you." He said it the way he'd said it on the porch at Whitfield's farm, simply, the weight of the thing made small and direct by being said without decoration. "Go ride," she said, "and come back through." She hung up and went back to turning over the beds, her hands in the good Kentucky soil, the work available, and the day clear. The shed was finished before the first frost. Hawk had done the roof in 2 days exactly as he'd said, and the result was a structure considerably better than the original, with better ventilation and a concrete floor sealed against moisture, and shelving that could hold twice what the old one had. Dorothy moved Ray's tools back in the ones that had survived and added new ones where the old ones were gone. She stood in the doorway of the finished shed one morning in November and looked at the property, at the garden beds put to sleep for winter, at the house with its working kitchen and its porch swing and its 41 years of medical textbooks on the shelf in the spare bedroom that she kept meaning to donate and never quite did. At the meadow where a camp had been, and was now just meadow again, the grass recovering from the weeks of occupation. She thought about the word that had come to her standing outside the Louisville courthouse in October. The word was stable. And what came after stable, what stability was the precondition for, was growth. The slow, not always visible, not always linear growth of a thing that had been hurt and was coming back. A county, a woman, a family that existed between a biker with a circuit to ride and a retired nurse with a garden to tend. She was not a sentimental person. She had spent too many years in rooms where sentiment was a luxury the situation couldn't afford. But she was a person who believed in accounting for what was true, in keeping accurate records, and the accurate record of the past months was this. Something had been built that was real. The case, yes, and the investigation, but also the simpler thing, the thing that didn't have an official record, the thing that was two people carrying their separate weight toward a common problem, and finding in the doing of it that the weight was lighter when it was carried in proximity to someone else. She went inside and made coffee and thought about October 15th. There were commission meetings coming. There were health board follow-ups. There was Cassie, who was back in Lexington now, in her own apartment working, rebuilding, calling Dorothy on Sunday evenings with the rhythm of someone who had found a dependable thing and was taking care of it. There was work. There was always work. Dorothy Callahan poured her coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook to a fresh page and began to write the list for the week, because lists were how you organize what mattered into the order it needed to happen in. And the order was important, and the mattering was everything. Outside, the Kentucky hills held their ground in the November morning, solid and enduring, the kind of landscape that had absorbed hard seasons and harder men for 200 years and was still standing. Somewhere on a circuit through Virginia, a gray-bearded man on a Harley was navigating his way back through country he'd been riding for 16 years, toward a county he'd come to know in a new way, toward a woman who would have coffee ready before he arrived. He'd be early. She knew that. She would let him be early. That was, as it turned out, more than enough.